podcast, How Stories Shape and Change Our Lives. Thanks to everyone who is choosing to come along this journey with me as I begin part 3 of the story of my own religious deconstruction, which again is my own story about myself. A significant component of my newfound freedom from old religious stories that I had once carried and was in the process of abandoning or restoring in some way was my ability to draw wisdom or truths from any and all human traditions of human nature, not restricting myself any longer to the confines of just one particular religious or theological upbringing, creed, or dogma. You know, it's amazing what your natural curiosity and imagination can connect to and learn about when you let them free. And you don't have to especially carry the threat of some kind of eternal damnation with you in your back pocket everywhere you go, in case you say the wrong thing, think the wrong thing, or believe the wrong thing. The predominant lenses I was now adopting to continue my ongoing exploration into the nature of the human condition were the science of human psychology and a burgeoning academic understanding of the function of myths and fairy tales, storytelling. In the previous episode, I had alluded to religious suspicions of human emotions as being suspect or devious because, again, they were seen as symptoms of a sinful human nature. In this sense, emotions were more or less the unfortunate byproducts of this sin disease, and it was our job to tame them, starve them, repress them, ignore them, and even sometimes when things got really desperate, pray them away. And my apologies to all, especially in the LGBTQI plus communities that have had the misfortune of not only hearing that phrase, but having the act of that phrase perpetrated upon them and being religiously traumatized by it ongoing. It's unacceptable. And I'm sorry that it exists. We were taught that our emotions were essentially liars, intentionally misleading and obscuring the truth. They were designed to lure us, perhaps into more sinful appetites and behaviors and away from God. The human imagination, with all of its emotional obfuscations and distractions, became the ultimate thing for us to have to conquer within ourselves, because that sinful human imagination was always and ever in direct contrast with God's will for our lives. I was introduced to the writings of Carl Jung and the subsequent and various schools of depth psychology that have come from a lot of his original ideas in my graduate program. So in these avenues or school of thought, I found myself reading an entirely different script about the nature of the human condition, the nature of our emotions, and the nature of imagination itself. Rather than devious avatars of our quote-unquote sinful flesh that must be conquered and ultimately transcended, our own emotional awareness and power of imagination were instead seen as vital parts of our being and our spirit and avenues through which we could learn and encounter the depth, the complexity, and even the numinous awe of our own human nature, which was to be cherished and cared for, paid attention to, studied, not bemoaned and enslaved by. Carl Jung understood the power and the significance of outer symbols, myths, and rites and stories as expressions of our own human nature, projected outwardly in the form of stories, things for us to be able to interact with. So folks like Jung, Joseph Campbell, Marie-Louise von Franz, and many, many others, they were not teaching us to point away from ourselves, to point away from the inner life, to instead gaze at the distant heavens in the sky. No, they were pointing inward. They were pointing inward to show us that this is where we find and connect with the divine. They were not attempting to build a new religion or create a new systemic theology of any kind. They were rather deeply engaged with this language of myth and symbols. And in this language, when one uses a word like divine, it's not necessarily referring to an objectified, transcendent, godlike entity. It is rather referring to those aspects of our human nature that a lot of us remain unaware of, but project outwardly through symbols, through stories, through myths, and yes, through collective rites and rituals, projecting them into outward forms of expression for the purpose of helping us develop a better relationship with ourselves. For Jung and other depth psychologists, this was the necessary work of all human beings, and it was by far not at all easy or clear, but wholeness was ultimately only to be found to the extent that one could develop a way to interact with one's shadow side or unconscious self. There is no wholeness without the shadow. This is all revelation for me. It was a pivotal component in my ongoing apocalypsis of my own soul, now untethered from much of what it had been anchored to and asked to accept, defend, protect, and promote, and attach itself to in my earlier religious upbringing. This is my soul now in flux, in transition, and it was both ecstasy and terror all at the same time. I was feeling, at the time, an eruption of enlightenment. And I remember thinking naively to myself at that time, oh my God, I see where we as a religion have gotten some important things wrong. Here I am now learning to see things more accurately, and if I can just sort of bring this information back to my religious forebears and walk them through it to see the things that they have missed, that they don't know about yet, they'll see this proverbial light and they'll come around. And together we can reset the course of things that have gone terribly wrong in our religion and make it a more powerful force or impetus for love, for healing and reconciliation in the world that it was originally supposed to be. Yeah, I really believed that. And learning that that was not at all the case was a devastating fall into grief and despair for me. Something which I'm going to get a little bit further into later on. Back to my own apocalypsis. I began to understand that God, whatever or whomever that was to be more reliably found in my own dreams, my own active imagination sessions, in connecting with powerful symbols that spoke to something more visceral than intellectual, say. There's actually some theological precedence for this way of thinking in the Christian tradition, in the concept known as the Imago Dei, which means the image of God imprinted within us. This idea was that if we want to know God better, we also need to, first and foremost, know ourselves better. Let me be clear on a particular point here, because I can feel some of you getting a little prickly about this right now. The idea is not that you are God or that you become God in the sense that the human ego might want to capture and think of it. No, that's not it. The idea, rather, is that God is not just transcendent, God is immanent, or at the very least, both immanent and transcendent. Matthew Fox, you remember him? He had a catchy term for this idea of both immanent and transcendent that he called panentheistic. This idea, counter to the doctrine of original sin, is that it is through the exploration of deeper understanding of ourselves, in the sacredness of ourselves, of our own human nature, that we begin to see more of whatever we believe who and what God actually is. The idea of the sacred or the holy was something to be tangibly experienced by connecting with one's own inner divine spark within. Not just some distant, impossible, detached high ideal to which none of us really had any hope of ever, quote unquote, achieving. Do you want to find God? Well, she's right there. She dwells within as well as without. As a therapist, it is my job to help people heal from wounds and traumas, and to the extent possible, learn to trust and value themselves as human beings. I could never do that if I were still holding tight to a doctrine like original sin or any other kind of doctrine that resembles that or sympathizes with that in some way. This is how my deconstruction story would contribute to my emerging identity as a therapist, including the underlying principles that would guide my therapeutic process throughout my career. It wasn't about teaching people how to fix themselves. It was about teaching people how to learn to accept themselves as sources for their own wisdom, to learn how to trust themselves, to learn how to feel safe with themselves, to begin to feel the sanctity of their humanness, the value and inherent worth of who and what they already are. Not some appeal coming from somewhere else to become something else, something different. Our human nature is not something to be transcended. Our human nature is something to be embraced and valued and regarded as a source of growth and wisdom and healing for us. It would be through these new lenses of understanding myself and the realities of human nature that I would come to understand, embrace, fall in love with the power of stories and how powerful stories guide every part of our human experience from birth to death. And that learning better about how we are telling our own stories, which stories we are choosing to tell of ourselves, and the idea that there are stories about us that can provide us with powerful tools of wisdom, healing, and insight, and pathways to inner reconciliation. This is all new and healing for me. As a psychological practitioner, I have learned that we as humans, we become what others expect us to become. We rise to that expectation. So if we expect our children to be of worth and value, they are far more likely to grow up with a strong sense of both. Conversely, if we expect our children to be worthless and incapable, they will also rise to that expectation. Human nature, I was beginning to learn, was not as simple and clear-cut as I had been taught to believe. It was no longer a simple matter of inherently bad or inherently good. It was and is complex. It's diverse. It is multi-layered. It's malleable. It's strong, but it's also fragile. We carry within us the capability for tremendous love and good, as well as tremendous evil and hatred. And it's hard to come to terms with that. But in that paradigm, there was much, much more to see, learn, and understand and experience about our human nature than just, well, sin and bad. Simplistic binaries no longer applied as plausible explanations or descriptions of who and what we are, as well as what we're capable of becoming as human beings. This is freedom for me. It was healing for me, shaking off one old shackle at a time. I was connecting finally to a deeper sense of self and a deeper sense of purpose in my own life. This new apocalypsis or revelation allowed me to begin a healing process between myself and a lot of other parts of myself that had been claimed by deep shame, fear, anxiety, years of inner anger and brutality that I had pointed at myself because I thought I was supposed to. But also some of the joy in the healing aspects of the deconstruction process were now beginning to be revealed to me. Religious trauma, it's a real phenomenon, and it does exist as a spectrum in terms of what it looks like, what it entails, what can cause it. It's different for everybody who experiences it and relates to the idea of it. You know, my caveat about that is this. Well, indeed, I do continue to struggle with the idea of organized religion personally. I don't believe that the religious impulse within us, in and of itself, is evil. Like most things, it is something I believe that can be used for both good and bad ends. And I believe that behind the religious impulse, it's the same thing that causes any of us to wonder or want to wonder more about our own nature and the nature of the universe itself, that which we ascribe the idea of mystery to. And I don't believe that this is an impulse that must or even can be expunged from the human condition. I think it's a rather fundamental, foundational aspect of the human condition. And is essentially, at least, I believe it's good for us to want to nurture that and explore it with more curiosity in both healthy and illuminative ways. And yes, I do believe that the religious impulse pointed in the direction of genuinely wanting to be a vehicle of love, of help, and of service to humankind can be an incredibly powerful force for healing and love and reconciliation. You know, living in Seattle, I'm very lucky to be surrounded by so many religious leaders and congregations that are not following the script of empire, the script of power and dominance, but rather are following the script of love and acceptance and justice, to stand in solidarity with those on the margins, to invite them in to say, hey, you are of just as much worth and value and love as anybody. And I do stand in solidarity with them as I would stand in solidarity with any movement or people who choose to stand up for love and stand against injustice, hatred, and cruelty. Unfortunately, where we can see the religious impulse start to develop a capacity for becoming a vehicle for evil in the world is to the extent that it gets trapped by and in solidarity with the virtues and values of empire itself, as opposed to the values and virtues of love and liberation. We know from our history the countless devastating effects that religious empire, in the service of power domination, nationalism, chauvinism, fundamentalism, and ethnic supremacy, can and does cause on an alarmingly regular basis. And we must develop an ability, if there's any hope for healing those institutions, to speak truth to our history and to this phenomenon, no matter how uncomfortable or disillusioning that might make us feel. Given our history, I think it's fair to ask the question, is the religious impulse then always doomed to gravitate towards these preferred enclaves of empire, power, certainty, all the trappings of rigid patriarchy and hierarchy? Are any of our institutions free from this apparent pull in that same direction? It's a very valid question to ask. And again, if we review our own history as a human species, the evidence looks fairly damning. But the enduring question for me, however, is not what appears to be likely or even inevitable, but whether or not it is a necessary condition of our human nature that leaves us with no agency or choice to reject it. And if I ask the question that way, then my answer so far is religion doomed to gravitate towards empire would have to be no. I don't believe that we are incapable of making a different choice. And I believe that there are more ways than one to engage in the great mysteries of life that teach us love and healing and reconciliation, rather than to have to restrain them to dogmatic ideas or principles that keep them static and stale, incapable of growing and learning. There are a fair number of reasons why our species continues to gravitate towards the former, being empire, rather than the latter, which again is probably a topic that deserves its own full set of episodes. One aspect of our human nature that appears to be fundamental and very persistent is our own natural curiosity and capacity for wonder and numinous awe, to want to engage, experience, and learn more about the great mysteries of our existence. This, in fact, is the creative impulse itself. It resides in every human being in an infinite multitude of different ways, whether we think we're creative or not, whether we are aware of our creativity or not. Creativity is one of the primary tools that we learn to use when we tell a story, or any form of art that can express itself, because all forms of art tell a story in their own language. The language of myth and fairy tales are ones that have resonated the most with me, not only as a human being with his own natural curiosity, but also as a therapist and working with the different stories of the people, all my clients, all the different stories of themselves that they bring into my office with them. Myths and fairy tales in particular are powerful creative projections of our inner lives and our hidden lives. We project them into stories so that we can see them and interact with them, and so that we can develop, if we wish, a relationship with them that is life-giving and instructive. It can show us who we are and where we're going. It can show us which of our stories that we have adopted remain true and vital and life-giving. It can also show us where some stories that we've adopted no longer function, no longer help us, or no longer relevant to us because we've grown beyond them. The language of myth, I have learned, speaks to something that many of its modern-day scholars and practitioners refer to as the truth behind the truths. So the function of myths and fairy tales are not to provide us with facts per se, as distinguished from ongoing, eternal truths of our own human nature, but also how we choose to be in relationship with not only our own nature, but the nature of the earth, the ecosystem of the earth, the world in which we inhabit. As we continue to learn more about ourselves and our world, our universe, etc., our myths by necessity must change and grow and adapt with us and alongside of us. We are the co-creators of our own myths. We read ourselves into them as much as they read themselves into us. Those aspects of myths and fairy tales that appear to have kind of a timeless or transcendent quality to them, meaning they remain more or less true in different forms, regardless of where we are in our history as a species. We call these archetypal truths, meaning that there is a universality to them that extends beyond time and space. A real easy example of this is the concept of mother. The idea of mother is a transcendent kind of idea across all cultures and all times. So in that sense, it's an archetypal idea. You know, old myths like the stories of Psyche and Eros, Echo and Narcissus, they are not real in the factual historical sense, but true in the sense that both stories reveal back to us some essential truths and realities of our own human condition. And there is something that remains familiar and recognizable to us in these stories that does remain true across time and space. I began to understand better why the various creation stories of all of the world's religions were often referred to as myths. Again, not because they were untrue, but rather deeply true, timelessly true, manifestations of our experience of our own human nature and our understanding of who we are and where we come from. A myth is a story that teaches or shows us something essentially true about ourselves, including how we understand and observe our relationship to what we call the gods of our myths. Myths, I began to learn, were active, alive, ongoing stories. They change and grow with us as we learn more about ourselves, as we progress as a species through history. These myths necessarily, again, had to change and adjust as we transitioned as a species from disparate nomadic tribal enclaves to larger agricultural societies and groups, which then gave birth to cities and eventually nation states. Both religion and the emergence of the scientific method have had to grow alongside each other and change alongside each other and react to new things that we have learned about ourselves and this world and universe that we occupy. A healthy myth remains so to the extent that it is free to grow, change, and adapt with us. We have the power to inform it, and it also has the power to inform us. An institutionalized religion, in my opinion, is the evidence of a myth gone cold and stale, left to die as it gets trapped or isolated in a particular moment or fragment of time. Unable to continue to grow, adapt, learn, to keep moving forward and add to the story, including having an ability to change the story. You know, I mentioned that innate sense of imagination, curiosity, and awe that is ingrained in all of us. Our need to qualify and quantify things for ourselves is also something that's very deeply ingrained in our human nature. And our enduring need to reach out to experience, comprehend, and make sense of the great mysteries of life that awaken in our imaginations is equally matched by our drive to attain and find a sense of certainty and safety. So again, while I don't believe that we are incapable of making different choices when it comes to how we choose to perceive and grapple with the great mysteries of existence, we will always have to strive to do so in the middle of that great tension between these two great impulses in our human nature that often feel in opposition to each other. And our job is not to conquer one and exalt the other. Our job is to learn how to better balance the tension between the two. This third option is always going to be the more difficult one. And it requires a tremendous amount of work to make ourselves more conscious, to make ourselves more intentional, to be more wise and compassionate with ourselves, which is why we seldom choose this path as a species and keep falling back into the binaries, particularly the binary of empire, which is fed by that need exclusively for certainty and safety. That's why we have trouble finding it. The human experience appears to be fraught with an endless collection of balancing acts that we're all trying to work out, both individually and collectively. The impulse to want to reach towards mystery or that which is currently unknown or unexperienced to us in some way is a powerful one, and it's predicated, though, on the idea of that which is known, fixed, and already understood. It's like the exception that proves the rule in some sense. Whatever our work is moving forward, it's not the work of conquering one and eradicating the other, but learning how the conversation between the opposing forces within us actually needs to be there to contribute to our ability to continue to move and grow, evolve, and that there's a wisdom to that is important for us to learn and discover. Look, we can no more rid ourselves of the religious impulse than we can the mythological impulse, because I believe they're both rooted in the same thing. The religious impulse makes sense in terms of giving us shared language, shared symbols, shared traditions, and shared rites, the way that we sort of act out what we believe and pay homage to this experienced mystery together as communities. And this ideally is what all forms of religion ought to be and ought to look like. However, as we've just learned, no thing that exists in the light of day exists without its shadow impulse. And the unchecked, unacknowledged, and undealt with shadow is always, quote unquote, doomed to act out in cruel ways, in ways that are seeking power over rather than existence with. The unacknowledged and the unexamined shadow is what is responsible, I believe, for most of the evil that we have perpetrated against ourselves, against each other, and against the planet itself throughout our history. The collective work here on a fundamental level is really no different than the work of the inner individual psyche itself. It's not necessarily about getting rid of all the undesired elements that feel in opposition to each other, but accepting the reality of all of those elements as existing, and then figuring out what the work of reconciliation is supposed to look like between them. We don't need to look far for evidence of how we have abused the religious impulse and used our spiritual and religious institutions as tools or methods to achieve great power and exercise incalculable cruelty throughout our history. Of course, it's not just religious institutions, it's any institution that we can name that falls under the same spell and under the same rationale. It can include institutions of business, government, political, social, academic, etc. It can be anything. It does not matter what the rationale for the institution is, because the first rule of the institution, any and all institutions, is preserve the institution itself. Rule number one, always. And once that happens, whatever ongoing stories or mysteries that may have led us to that point to begin to establish such things in the first place become then trapped and unable to grow any further. One of the things that my studies in modern mythology and human psychology have taught me, however, is that there is always a way through this kind of conundrum if we give ourselves permission to learn and do the work of it. And the problem is, it's the way through is usually the one that we don't want to take. But here's what's important. Joseph Campbell used to say that the ego needs a mirror with which it can see itself. And this is what myths and fairy tales are. They are mirrors. They are how we experience ourselves through the stories that we create and retell in fantastical fashion, in dramatic fashion, in ways that, quite frankly, get our attention. I use the example of myths and fairy tales here because I have become, again, aware of just how powerful, creative, intuitive, and instructive they are and can be. And, mythology is not a substitute for religion or a religion itself. That would sort of defeat the point of it. Rather, it's a method that gives us a wide variety of tools from which we can learn to use and to continue to see more of ourselves and experience more of ourselves more fully, to continue to grow, and even teaching us how to let go of and heal old punishing stories of ourselves that we no longer recognize as true or instructive or valid for us. The power of myth works for all of us, regardless of whatever our tribal or foundational or religious beliefs may be. And that's one of the beauties of it. I recognize that my experience and my assessment of the phenomenon of organized religion is my own. And it's not necessarily shared by everyone, certainly, who may be listening to this episode. That's okay. I want to reiterate that my purpose in telling my story is not to suggest that it is to be considered instructive or prescriptive necessarily for anybody else. You may find yourself having some legitimate quibbles with some of my definitions and understandings of different things that I've brought up. And you might even be more correct about some of those than I am. It's okay, because I'm just here to tell my story. And I share it because I believe in the sharing of stories with each other. I do believe that stories are sacred in and of themselves. Sacred because they exist, just as I believe we as human beings are sacred simply because we exist. The death of my father when I was young. This was the catalyst for my own apocalypsis and my journey into deconstruction. There's more of that story to come. It's going to come in the next episode. So, if you've continued to join me this far, I love and appreciate you so much and would encourage you to keep following me. We've got 2 more episodes of this to go. Bless all of you, and thank you.